Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Christmas time is here, and for this year's Christmas video, we're looking at the background of the sign of Immanuel from Isaiah chapter 7. Now, in this chapter, the prophet promises that a young woman will conceive and give birth to a son whose name will be Immanuel, which means God with us. Now, this prophecy has a very long tradition of interpretation as a foretelling of Jesus, and that's certainly how the evangelist Matthew understood it, so who's going to argue with that? But as we'll see, while this prophecy is applied to Jesus, it's also applied to someone else. The context in which the prophecy was given can give some insights, not only into whose birth was originally prophesied, but also into some greater context and meaning around its application to Jesus. Let's dig into the Syro-Ephraimite War and Isaiah 7.
The Syro-Ephraimite War was a regional crisis between the secondary states of the Levantine Iron Age that took place in the 730s BC. This war is the immediate context of Isaiah 7 and the sign of Immanuel. So, what was this war? We'll get there, but before we look at the 730s, let's take a step back and look at some of the history and geopolitics which led up to it. Specifically, let's look at a particular episode in the mid-9th century. The important players for understanding the Syro-Ephraimite crisis are Judah, Israel, the Assyrians, and Damascus, or Aram Damascus, the Aramean polity that ruled from Damascus. Now, these polities have a long history together, and it's important to understand that the Syro-Ephraimite crisis is just one iteration in a very long pattern of conflicts among them. Going back to the 850s, over 100 years prior to the Syro-Ephraimite War, the Assyrian king was Shalmaneser III, and he was expanding the territory of the Assyrian Empire as all Assyrian kings tried to do. Now, Shalmaneser was pretty good at territorial expansion, and after fighting some of his traditional rivals and enemies to his north and east, he campaigned westward into Syria. He was opposed by a coalition of 11 kings, including Hadadezer of Aram, almost certainly meaning Aram Damascus, and Ahab the Israelite. Now, these two provided the most significant forces and so represent the strongest forces in the coalition. This coalition fought Shalmaneser at the Battle of Karkar in Syria in 853. The battle was not conclusive, but it stopped Assyrian expansion for a time, long enough for the coalition to fall apart and its members to try to dominate one another. Just a few years later, Ahab was killed fighting against his former ally Hadadezer in a battle of territorial dispute in Transjordan. Shalmaneser was ultimately able to campaign again into Syria, where he fought Hazael, Hadadezer's successor, and he received tribute from Jehu, king of Israel. The second half of the 9th century and the first half of the 8th century saw Israel, Judah, and Damascus jockeying for dominance in the southern Levant, all while facing the expanding power of the Assyrians. Israel and Damascus had paid tribute to Assyria in the course of the 8th century and were essentially vassal states, but they sought to change that in the 730s. So in the 730s, a man named Rezin ruled Aram Damascus. Damascus had been a tributary of Assyria, as was Israel, but again, Rezin sought to change that. In Israel, a man named Pekah was king. Now, let me say there's a lot of court intrigue and politicking that results in Pekah being king. The chronology here in the Book of Kings is particularly confused, and how and when he was king in Israel is a matter of some debate amongst biblical scholars. What I think is actually most likely is that Pekah ruled a nominally independent king in Gilead or Transjordan, while Pekahiah was officially king of Israel in Samaria. He may have been ruling this nominally independent kingdom at the behest or with the support of Rezin in Damascus. We plan to dive into this in a future video, so if you're interested in Israelite geopolitics in the 8th century, just subscribe so you don't miss that. Anyway, Rezin in Damascus and Pekah in Israel made plans to shirk off Assyrian rule. The alliance of Rezin and Pekah is called the Syro-Ephraimite Alliance, as Damascus is in Syria and Ephraim was the dominant tribal element in Israel. This alliance represents a kind of new anti-Assyrian coalition, a la Ahab and Hadadezer. This coalition isn't intended to stop Assyrian aggression. That ship has sailed. Instead, they want to cease paying tribute to Assyria, but they know they can't do it on their own. So they first turn their focus on Judah and attack Ahaz. Now, scholars are split on why they turn against Judah. The traditional narrative is that they want another kingdom in their alliance against Assyria and see that Ahaz, king of Judah, doesn't want to help. So if he won't help, they will replace him with someone else, which is what Isaiah 7 says. They'll replace him with some dude only identified as the son of Tabeel. Some scholars now think this coalition wasn't seeking to incorporate Judah into their anti-Assyrian campaign after all. Instead, some think this isn't an anti-Assyrian coalition, but just a mutually beneficial arrangement, and the Syro-Ephraimite League is designed to be a power grab and to take Transjordanian territory from Judah so that they can take control of the very lucrative trade routes that run through it. The Philistines and the Edomites also get in on the attack against Judah, which may be their way of trying to gain control over these trade routes and opportunistically enrich themselves. So there may be something to this argument. Well, whatever the impetus for the alliance, we're still left with Judah facing this coalition on its own. Ahaz is a young king at this point and is understandably terrified. He is literally attacked on all sides and by superior forces. So what is a king supposed to do? Well, he calls for backup from Tiglath-Pileser III, the king of Assyria. Now, Tiglath-Pileser III was a major figure in Assyrian history and even world history. He reformed the Assyrian Empire, expanded his territory, and turned Assyria from a regional power into a world power. And starting with Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria would enter a period of unprecedented success that would last until the empire's dissolution over a century later. By the time Ahaz appeals to him, Tiglath-Pileser has already had several successful campaigns, expanding Assyrian hegemony north, east, and to the west into northern Phoenicia and Syria. This plea for help is Ahaz's nuclear option, and he goes for it. Now, if you're Tiglath-Pileser, this is a godsend, so to speak. He could legitimately claim his conquests further into the southern Levant were literally invited, because no matter what the intention of the Syro-Ephraim alliance, whether it was a purposeful attempt to make an anti-Assyrian coalition or just an attempt to enrich the kingdoms of Damascus and Israel, the Assyrians would have seen this as anti-Assyrian activity that needed attention. So Tiglath-Pileser took action in a campaign in the late 730s. Tiglath-Pileser defeated Damascus and annexed all of its lands. He killed Rezin and destroyed his hometown. He captured the city of Tyre, which had supported the Syro-Ephraimite alliance. He defeated Israel and annexed parts of the kingdoms as the provinces of Dor, Megiddo, and Transjordan, leaving only Samaria and its surrounding areas free from direct Assyrian control. Ahaz had to pay significant tribute to Assyria to maintain his throne. He is also said to have altered the temple to gain favor with his Assyrian overlord. Ahaz preserved his throne, but at great cost. His deal with Tiglath-Pileser III is regarded as a bit of a Faustian bargain. He retained his throne, but lost his kingdom's independence and cultic purity. Now, with all this in mind, let's look at Isaiah 7.
Now, for starters, we aren't going to read all of Isaiah 7, and we aren't going to dive into the redactional history of the book and this passage. We're aware of it, we have our opinions on it, but we're not going to deal with it all here and now. Instead, we're going to pull on some themes and ideas in this chapter that we understand may have developed differently in different redactional strands. But again, we'll leave that discussion alone for now. Also, we're going to put up some relevant passages, but I would encourage you to pause and read Isaiah chapter 7 right now, or you can go back and read it later for the full context of this passage. Now, first of all, it's clear that this chapter is set in the immediate context of this Syro-Ephraimite war. The prophet Isaiah meets Ahaz, identified as the house of David, at the city of Jerusalem's waterworks. Now, this is an important element. Ahaz is not just some king. He stands in for the entire Davidic dynasty. And given that symbolism, it's important to remember the official theology of the Davidic dynasty in the Yahwistic promise in 2 Samuel 7. An unconditional promise of assistance to all kings in the line of David. Yahweh was loyal to David and his descendants, no matter what. We see Ahaz was at the aqueduct, no doubt preparing for the imminent siege of the city, and Isaiah goes to meet him there with his son named Shear-Jashub. Now, Isaiah's kids all have important names with significant meanings. Shear-Jashub means something like a remnant will return. The boy's name is a kind of threat, an assurance of exile and destruction from which only a remnant will return. Isaiah brings his son, and Ahaz is supposed to take note that there are consequences to not following after Yahweh. Destruction and exile are coming if you aren't faithful. So the meeting is off to a great start. War and siege are looming, and Isaiah shows up with this living, breathing sign of impending doom. But Isaiah encourages Ahaz rather than condemning him. He tells Ahaz he knows what people are saying. He knows what they plan to do at the expense of Ahaz. He knows Ahaz is fearful, and he commands Ahaz to be calm and not be afraid. Because this is what the sovereign Yahweh says. It will not take place. It will not happen. He proceeds to mock both Rezin and Pekah, even refusing to say the usurper's name, only Remaliah's son. And who the heck is Remaliah? But Isaiah ends his mocking with, "If you will not believe, you will not last." Isaiah is reminding Ahaz of Yahweh's promise to the Davidic line. He uses variants of the words used in places like 2 Samuel 7, where David's house will be made sure, or that it will endure. There are linguistic callbacks to places that recall God's promise to the Davidic line. Isaiah is calling Ahaz back to faith in Yahweh and his promises, but this is easier said than done. He is calling him to be faithful and rely on the promises of Yahweh when the whole kingdom is literally being invaded with the goal of killing him and ending his family line. Now, we don't know how Ahaz responded. It seems that he does not reject his fear and return to living in light of Yahweh's promises, because in the next verse, God, through Isaiah, ups the ante in offering a sign. Now, here, a sign means some physical manifestation of a theological truth, a tangible marker of the claims of God. He basically says, do I need to prove it to you? Do I need to show you that faith in me is enough? The king refuses to ask for a sign. He claims he doesn't want to put God to the test, but we should probably see this as a show of false piety. Now, he doesn't want to be a part of all of this, it seems. So, Isaiah offers a sign that is neither asked for nor wanted, the sign of Immanuel. He says the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and she will name him Immanuel. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy knows enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be abandoned. The Lord will bring on you, on your people, and on your father's house, such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim separated from Judah, the days of the king of Assyria. Now here's the famous passage that Matthew and early Christians applied to the birth of Jesus. But there's a lot more going on here. Now first off, most translations will say virgin here, but scholars are in agreement that this word alma just means a young woman of a marriageable age. Her status as a virgin is not particularly relevant to the sign, at least in its original context. It's assumed that a young woman of marriageable age would be a virgin. Her stated status as a virgin is secondary. The circumstances of the birth aren't important. It is the child who is important. It's the child's name that is of particular note, Immanuel, which means God with us. Here, the child's name, unlike She'er Jashub, is positive and affirming. It recalls the Yahwistic promise to the house of David. 2 Samuel 7 is an oracle from Yahweh where he states, "I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them, so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning." The child's name Immanuel recalls promises like this for Ahaz. But even more significant than the sign of the child itself is the use of the child as a chronological marker. By the time he knows right from wrong, which interpreters put at around 2 years old, now that makes me think interpreters haven't spent a lot of time around toddlers, but that's neither here nor there. We can roll with that. Anyway, by the time this child Immanuel is 2 years old, he'll be eating curds and honey, which is a clear callback to the promised land being flowing with milk and honey, a metaphor for prosperity. Isaiah is saying that before 2 years' time is up, Judah could be back to being a prosperous land because God is with us. Now, the identity of this child has caused a lot of debate. While this is cited by the evangelists as applying to Jesus, it was also meant as a sign for its own time, that a child would be born in the time of Isaiah. Who you think it applies to kind of depends on when you think this text was written, which again gets into the redactional history of the passage. Now, typically, Josiah and Hezekiah are cited as the child prophesied by Isaiah. Hezekiah is the son of Ahaz who rebelled against the Assyrians, trying to throw off the vassal status that his father welcomed. The last half of the chapter is sometimes seen as a literary effort to convince Hezekiah to not rebel because of the devastation that could come. But given the chronology in Kings, even as complicated as it is, we see that Hezekiah was born before the Syro-Ephraimite War, so it may not be likely that the Immanuel sign is Hezekiah. Others think the child was a son of the prophet, but the identity of the mother as an Alma seems to indicate she's not married yet or has not had children, and given what we know of Isaiah's family, that doesn't seem to fit. Ultimately, the identity of the immediate fulfillment of the Immanuel sign doesn't seem to be that important. What is important in the immediate context of this passage is that we're led to believe that Ahaz rejects the sign. Isaiah continues that God will bring on Judah days that haven't been experienced since the kingdom of Solomon split, a period that was followed by decades of war. What is coming, Isaiah says, is worse, the king of Assyria. Isaiah is calling Ahaz to faithfulness, to accept the sign of Immanuel, and to trust that God can protect him from what are really minor threats in the Syro-Ephraimite alliance. He warns Ahaz that to reject faith in God will have dire consequences by Israel being brought into the brutal orbit of Assyria. Now, we do have a video discussing how this process mimicked the conditions of societal collapse for Assyrian provinces that you can check out here. Isaiah describes how devastated the land will be in the concluding verses of chapter 7. Assyria coming into the land will bring devastation. Now, this turns out to be a bit of a turn on the curds and honey phrase earlier. While this is usually a metaphor for prosperity, now Isaiah prophesies that people will eat only curds and honey because the land is so devastated. There are no crops. People only have a calf and a couple of sheep. Isaiah lays it out in stark terms. Choose faith in Yahweh's promises or reject them at your peril. Ahaz refuses the path of faithfulness and instead places his trust in the king of Assyria. So, there's how we understand Isaiah 7 in its original context at the beginnings of the Syro-Ephraimite War. It's an interpretation that you're probably much less familiar with than the way the Christian tradition interprets it as a promise of the coming of Jesus. So, does this invalidate the traditional Christian interpretation of the passage? Or is there a way for these interpretations to coexist? Now, this brings up an important point in my own theological training that I always try to pay attention to when looking at these familiar Old Testament passages that prophesy the life of Jesus. Now, it's important for us as Christian interpreters, if that applies to you, to interpret these passages in their original context first before we move to their Christological interpretation. This two-stage interpretive process is important for a couple of reasons. First, it keeps us rooted in the original context of the passage as we interpret the text further. Now, one reason this is important is that it respects Jewish interpretations of the text as valid alongside Christian interpretations. These texts are not only for Christians and for our Christological understandings, but they remain vital parts of the Jewish tradition, and we shouldn't dismiss these interpretive traditions out of hand. These texts are inherited by Christians from the Jewish tradition, and we need to respect that tradition as we go about the interpretive process. Isaiah is so full of these prophetic references to Jesus that it's sometimes called the fifth gospel. But we can't forget that it had significance in its original context as well. Another passage that's a good example for this practice is Isaiah 53, the so-called suffering servant passage. Now, Christians interpret this passage as foreshadowing the suffering of Jesus on the cross, but some interpreters think that in its original context, it was a metaphor for the suffering of Israel instead. In the case of Isaiah 7, we should understand the immediate significance of this prophecy as it relates to Israel's circumstances under Ahaz before we move to Christological interpretation. Now, that brings us to the second reason for taking this sort of interpretive care, and that is to enhance our interpretation of the text by understanding its original context. Now, this applies even to passages that are familiar to us or that seem to be plainly Christological in nature. In the case of Isaiah 7, understanding this text as it's framed by questions of choosing faithfulness to God or worldly powers leads us to a deeper understanding of its application to Christology. The ties to the Davidic covenant anticipate its fulfillment in Jesus as Israel's eternal king in the line of David. The sign of the birth of a child called Immanuel, God with us, reaches its most profound conclusion in the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. This practice of attending to what you might call the two horizons of the text even led early Christian theologians to understand the atonement in light of these Old Testament realities that anticipate Jesus. This so-called recapitulation view of the atonement is anticipated by Justin Martyr, and it's most fully stated by Irenaeus of Lyon. It sees Jesus as fulfilling the requirements of faithfulness to God and adherence to the law where Adam and Israel had failed, and so being able to bear the sins of humanity and create the way for humankind to find new birth in him. Where Ahaz, in the line of David, failed to accept the sign of Immanuel's birth, Jesus himself was and is this sign coming from David's line for us to receive. The birth of God with us was the first step in Jesus making the way to new life for all of us. In this Christmas season, that's something for us to celebrate in any season. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe and check out some of our other Christmas videos. We've looked at the Magi, the Star of Bethlehem, and the Church of the Nativity, to name just a few. You can also check out our website, beneaththebible.com, and follow us on social media at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.